When a war broke out in 1939, I was a student on a Polish polytechnic in Lwów. On 17th of September 1939, Russians crossed the frontiers, and I was then a volunteer in the army, in Polish army, defending the Lwów against the German armies. When the Russian came out in 1939, 17th of September, we were instructed to give up the arms and change into the civilian clothes, and if possible, leave the Poland to join the Polish armies, which were at that time in Romania or Hungary, and then eventually went to France. In 11th of November 1939, I tried to cross the frontier with some group of Polish students to join the Polish army in Hungary. I was arrested on the frontier and I was taken to prison in southern Poland, and later I was taken back to Lwów, where I was born, and in 19th of December I was transported to Russia in the cattle wagons, and we went to the town of Dniedropietrowska in Ukraine, where we were in a prison for 6 months. Later on, we were sentenced to 8, 9, or 10 years of slave labor camps. We were sent to Białej Wieży, the place where the 10,000 Polish officers were in prison before they were sent to Katyn. From there, we were sent to Siberia, to the slave labor camps. In Siberia, we had to build our own huts to have accommodation for the winter. We were laborers, and we were cutting the trees and working in the woods and on the rivers. The average day in prison camp started about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. We got a little bit of bread and hot water, or they call it soup, and then we were sent for a whole day to the woods where we were cutting the trees and putting them on the banks of the frozen rivers. The whole day we were working there without any food, and if we didn't make our 100%, we didn't get the food which was supplied to us, supposed to be supplied to us. We only got as much as we earned that day. If we only made 50%, we only get 50% of the food which we're supposed to get. Results were there that most of the people were starving, and pretty soon some of the weaker men were dying of starvation or trying to escape, which was almost impossible because we were thousands of miles out of nowhere in the woods of Siberia. Winters were very cold, and we were sometimes working at about 50, 60 degrees below zero in a conditions were absolutely impossible to survive. We were not dressed properly. We didn't have no shoes, no boots, and no warm clothing. So the only way we could survive is to work hard as possible to keep warm. Then we were sitting by the fires, which was sometime we had to put the fires around the woods before we can cut the woods. Sometimes we were working 6 feet under the snow to be able to cut the woods. In the evening, when we came back to the barracks, we were given our portion of dark bread and again some soup, which they called it, the warm water, they called it soup. our barracks were mostly wooden, and they were not heated, except one small pot-belly stove on the middle of the hut, which didn't give enough heat for all of us for overnight. Quite often it happened that somebody froze in the night time. In the morning, when we were called for the next day work, we sometimes took the dead man between us so we could get his bread ration for a day. Later on, we left them on a bed, and Russian found them dead. The life like that, we were there about a year and a half, and conditions were getting worse and worse. And the Russians didn't care what would happen to us. Sometimes when somebody didn't disobey their orders, they just shot them, and they didn't bother even to pick up the bodies. We were treated just like slaves. We were there between us. There were some Russian people, some Slavic people, and some Romanian and Hungarians, which were prisoners of war or political prisoners. We were there, and we could only think about how we could survive and how we could get out. But it was almost impossible for anybody to escape. After the Germans invaded Russia, there was amnesty for Polish people, and the Polish army was formed in Russia, and we were released, and we were told to go to the south of Russia, to the Kazakhstan, where Polish army was forming. Of course, we didn't have no money for the food, so we had to travel on without the tickets, on the freight trains, and whenever possible we could catch any transportation. The time before, when we were released till I joined the army, I traveled for about 2 months from one place to another. I was trying to find my family, which was sent to Russia as prisoners. They were arrested in our hometown in Lvov in the middle of the night, and they were transported to the Uzbekistan, where they were left on a field without any food, without any housing. They had to go and search for the food and for the housing before they could settle and could make any living. They were my mother, my brother, my sister, and my father and my grandmother were there. And out of the whole family, my grandmother and my father died of starvation. They were left in Russia in the steppes in the winter time without any transportation, without any communication, and they were slowly dying out of starvation. After I was released from the prison, I tried to find my family, which was then moved to another part of Russia, another part of Russia, of Uzbekistan, where I found them. My mother, my brother, and my sister were only survivors at that time. I was with them for a couple of months. Then I went to join Polish army, which was then forming in Uzbekistan. In there, when I joined the army, I was taken to the Polish units, and soon after joining, I was sick with the typhoid fever. I then was in hospital, and at that time the first batch of the Polish army was transported from Russia to Iran, and later on to Palestine or England. I was left behind with another 5,000 Polish people who were at the time either in hospital or sick, and we had to wait another 3 or 4 months for another transport to go to Iran. I was in the Polish army in Iran, and later on I was transported to England, where I joined the Polish Air Force, and I was flying since 1942 till the end of the war in the Polish squadrons. My time in Russia, it's almost impossible to describe with words the condition of living, the way we were treated, and the way people survived those times, and in a frozen taigas, and how hard we had to work to be supplied with a piece of bread. Very often we took the leaves of the pine trees and ate them or chewed them because we had such a lack of vitamins that our teeth were loose and we were losing all the supplies of vitamins for the essential for life. My family, which was taken to Russia, they were there for 5 years before they came back to Poland. After the so-called amnesty for the Polish people, they were sent to the southern Russia, where they had to work very hard to survive. And even after the end of the war, they were forced to work hard another year before they could go back to Poland. Russians tried to force them to stay in Russia and take the Russian citizenship, because they didn't want as many Polish people to go back to Poland, because they were afraid of that Polish people will tell other nations or other people how they were treated in Russia. In that time, there were about 3 million people sent from Poland to Russia, out of which maybe 1 million got out. Approximately half of the people died of starvation or frozen or freeze to death, or were killed by Russians in the woods or in the mines of Kolyma and in the labor camps on Ural and other parts of Russia. When we were in the Polish army, we were still treated as something worse. We were not given any armaments. We were not permitted to have any exercise which would prepare us for the further action in a wartime. I was one of the lucky ones, which I was able to go from there to England and rejoin Polish Air Force, as I had some experience in flying before the war. Most of my friends who were in Russia never returned back to Poland after the war, because they were afraid that they would get the same treatment as we were treated in wartime. In England, we were interrogated by the British intelligence, and when we were telling them how we were treated in Russia and how we lived in Russia, they wouldn't believe us. They say that we have told them the stories which were not true because we hated Russians. They also didn't believe us when we were telling them about the atrocities of Hitler camps and prisons, when they were thousand people murdered to death and burned. They say that that was everything was propaganda. They were at that time they were friends with England and the United States, were friends with Russia, and they didn't want to hear anything which was derogative to the Russian image. My family is still in Poland. My mother is living there on a very little pension, and my sister and my brother are working very hard to meet their standard of living. I'm trying to help them as much as possible. I sometimes wonder if the communist regime will ever succeed in any part of the world with their policies and their economic programs. In Russia, in the wartime, there was approximately 40 million people in the prison camps. There were actually slaves working in the mines and roads and woods. And I believe there is about half of that amount still in Russia in prisons. W czasie naszego pobytu w więzieniu, at the time when we were in prison, before we were sentenced to the slave labor camps, we were often taken for interrogation and for investigation, and sometime which took several days. I was taken one day from our cell in the prison and transported to another part of town where there was another prison. I was given a single cell with a bed and good food, and I was really hoping that they were going to release me. What happened when I was there, they told me they have a few questions for me to ask. I was taken to the prosecutor, and for several hours I was waiting in a hallway before he got me inside the room. When he sat me down by the table, asked me if I was hungry, and gave me a glass of milk and later on some apple and white bread, which was luxury for me. And he started asking me about my life, my family in Poland, which I answered him truthfully how it was before the war. Then he asked me about my father. My father was a member of the council in our hometown, Lwów. Then he asked me if my father belonged to any party and if I knew any friends of his. And then he gave me the list about 50 names, and he asked me if I knew any of those names. I read those names, and some of them I knew, some of them I didn't. There were some associates of my father and friends of my father. And they then asked me if that was true, that they were all anti-communist. I told them I was too young to be involved in any politics, and I didn't know anything about my father's doing. And if they were his friends, they were most probably just social friends. And they insisted that I tell them that they were anti-communist, member of anti-communist. I refused to do that, so they sent me back to my cell. That was very early in the morning, because all the interrogations were made in the night in Russia. When I came to the cell, I pulled down the bed, which was folding bed, and I wanted to lie down and fall asleep. The guard came, folded the bed up, locked it up next to the wall and wouldn't let me lay down. I was there whole day. I was given fairly good food, but I was not allowed to sleep even 1 minute through the day. In the night time, about 9 o'clock, when everybody was going to bed, they called me out and they took me again to for the interrogation. Again, I was standing there and waiting to get inside for another series of interrogation. Finally, they invited me inside, and the same prosecutor, which was interrogating me before, again insisted that I would sign that list of the names. And after I refused it, he said he kept promising me that I will be released, that all my family will be treated better if I will sign that name of the list of people which they produced it to me. I again refused. And then I was put out in a hallway, stood against the wall, and I was there standing till the morning. In the morning they took me back to the cell, and again the same procedure. They gave me good food, but they wouldn't let me sleep. I was walking on the cell, and as soon as I sit down on the floor, the guard came and told me to get up and not to sit down or not to fall asleep. So I had to walk or sit or stay on my feet all day long. At night, it was again the same thing. They called me, and again they kept me waiting or asking the same question. After the third or fourth night, after I refused it, they sent me to another interrogation room, which was the woman. She put the gun on a table, and she sat me by the table, and the gun was within my reach. Then I looked at the gun. I knew the gun wasn't loaded, so I didn't bother to pick up the gun. And then suddenly she jumped out and said, "Oh, my goodness, how stupid of me. I left the gun in front of you." I said, "Well, it is stupid of you to leave the gun and load it." And she was so mad at me that she stood up, pulled up her skirt, which she didn't have any underwear, and she said, "Look, you dumb fool, you will live, but you will never be able or want to laugh again." At that moment, I was so shocked, I just turned around and I said, "Pfui, I wouldn't even touch anything like that." She was so offended. She took the gun and she wanted to hit me over the head, but she didn't do it. Then they sent me again out in the hallway, and there where I was standing for another several hours till the morning. The same thing repeated about day after day, night after night. Finally, I was so tired without the sleep that I didn't know if I was asleep or I was standing, or if I answer any question, I don't know what I answered. I don't know if I signed anything. And finally, I was sent back to my cell with another where I was taken from. And I learned from my friends in the cell that I was there for 24 days without the sleep. When I came back to my cell, I lay down on a bed, and again I couldn't fall asleep for another 2 days. I think I got used to living without sleeping. If anybody will ask me ever if I signed that list, I say I don't know. I was in such a state that I didn't know what I was doing, what I was talking about, and if I signed it or not, I really don't know till today. After that experience, I asked other people how they were treated in interrogation. Some people were treated the same way as me, and some people were beaten, they were tortured, and they were they even didn't know, they too didn't know if they finally signed something or not. I think after several days without sleep, or after being tortured, the man most probably will do anything they ask him to do. So if anybody have any statement from Russian, from communists, that he says something and he signs something, don't believe them. They have the way of forcing people to do impossible, and without any realization if they did it or not. Another example of that was when one of this very young guy, maybe 17 or 18, was taken from our cell, was kept for several days and interrogated, and when he came back, he was all black and blue, beaten up, swollen, and he had absolutely no desire to live. And when we asked him what was the questions they asked him, he said, I really don't know, because I never heard about those questions and about the people they were asking me before. And I asked him if they ask you to sign something. He said, yes, but I can't read. I couldn't read, and I couldn't read Russian. They gave me the statement which was written in Russian, and they told me to sign it. I didn't sign it. I don't know. Maybe after several days, maybe I signed it. But I still don't know what I signed it. If I signed it, I couldn't read it, so I don't know what I have signed. So they were treating different people different ways. They were playing on the people a certain emotion, promising either freedom or better life for their families, but in most cases it didn't work. They had to bring the people to the stage when they didn't really know what they were doing before they really finished investigating and interrogating them. Another thing is, I will tell you about the average day in a Russian camp, labor camp. As I said before, we were awakened about 6 o'clock in the morning, given a piece of bread and hot water, they call it either tea or soup, and then we were taken to the open space and put into the groups of people where we were standing regardless of the weather for 10, 15 or sometimes 20 minutes before they have an account of all the prisoners, and then they opened the gate and they took us to the work, which usually we had to march about 10 to 15 kilometers before we were in a place where we had to work. With us there were usually 3 or 4 Russian soldiers which are guarding us when we were working. Those poor guys were usually deserters from the Russian army, which they were sent in there, and they were given a little bit condition, better condition than us, but they were there just the same as we, the prisoners. Some of them were good to us. Some of them were very bad to us. I remember one day we were coming back from work, and one little guy was so tired that he was falling every few steps, and the guard told him to get up. When he couldn't get up, he just shot him there and left him in the snow. Another case was when we were working in a detail, and the big bear, Russian Siberian bear, came to us, and the one guard tried to shoot him. He missed him, and he released 2 German shepherds, which were then attacked the big bear. He stood up on his feet, and I think he must have been about 8 feet tall. And he killed both of the dogs and started going after us. The Russian guys tried to shoot him again and missed again, and then he threw his rifle and started running away. And one of our Polish guys, who was very good shot marksman, took the gun and shot the bear about 10 or 15 steps in front of him. When this bear died, this Russian soldier came to us and pleaded with us not to tell how it happened, because if a commanding officer would learn about that, he would be shot to death. He was so scared of their commanding officer that he did something wrong, that he would do anything to us at that time, just not to be told to the, not to be, so we wouldn't tell on him how everything happened. Russian people were actually good people. We had some help from them. We had a fairly good relation with the Russian people, except the communist guards and communist party members. When I was released from the prison, I was traveling on a freight trains, and every night I got out and slept, tried to find some sleeping accommodation, usually in a barn. And those Russian people were really very good. They gave us food, they took us in, and they were very sympathetic to our condition. In one village, I found a family by the table. There were two older folks, man and a wife, and two younger. And I could see that this younger guy was a communist and party member. And whenever I ask any question, they say everything was all right, the Stalin was very good, and so on. And I was very surprised that that old man was praising the Stalin and praising the communist regime. After some, we had something to eat, the old man took me to the barn and put me out in to sleep in there, give me a place to sleep in there, and he came to me and he asked me, did you believe everything I said about the communists and the party? I say, well, what could I do? Of course I believed. He say, don't believe it. My son is a member of the Communist Party, and I am afraid in front of him to criticize, because he would denounce me and I would go to prison. So that is the way the communists and the party rules the rest of the Russian nation. Everybody is scared that somebody will denounce them, and then they will go to prison and or will be destroyed. And in another case, when I was in prison, there was a guy, 80 years old. And when I asked him what did he do that he is in prison, he said he was the professor in a high school, and he was teaching the natural history. And in one of the lessons, he told his pupils, his students, that regime is destroying our natural resources by cutting all the trees, not having any program. And one of the students must have told that to the party, to the NKWD, or to some party member, and this guy was taken to prison, sentenced to 10 years of slave labor camps. Well, they didn't call that slave labor camps, 10 years of prison, because he was anti-communist and he was criticized the communist regime. The funny part of this was when there was about 5,000 of us in one church, and one day we were called and said that our sentences came. So we had to go in and sign that we have heard our sentences. each of us asked, when we were called, each of us asked them, how can I be sentenced if I didn't have any trial? They say, never mind if you had the trial or not. You're anti-communist, and you were sentenced to 8 years of prison. And I refused to sign. They say, never mind. We'll just sign for you and say that you are illiterate, that you can't sign your name. So they put 3 X's in there. And that was the way most of the people were sentenced and acknowledged their sentences. Most of us were either students or people with good education, which definitely could write and read, but none of them signed their sentence. So whenever a Russian were asked how come they didn't have our names signed, they said they were illiterate people who couldn't write and read. So we had to put the crosses because they couldn't read or write. That was the Russian system, which they generally did all over the place. Now, nobody was ever sentenced to die and died. I had one of my friends who was sentenced to death, and after a few days they came and asked him to make a plea for changing the death sentence to the life sentence. And he refused. They were so surprised, and they didn't really know what to do, because they were told by the higher authority that they need the people to work in the camps, so they couldn't shoot them. When this guy refused to sign it, they were pleading with them, they were with him. And finally they signed the 3 crosses in bottom of this application. And they say that Stalin was so good that he reversed his sentence from death sentence to the life imprisonment. Well, that was all very funny to us, because we were making jokes about that, and Russians couldn't understand why we were laughing, and they couldn't understand how we can refuse when we were asked to change our death sentence to the life imprisonment. Well, when we were told them, what's the difference? We'll die here or there, sooner or later. And if we die now, it'll be much quicker and much without any pain. And if we go to the prison for several years, we'll be suffering and we'll die anyway. So they couldn't understand our attitude. And after a while, they stopped asking us and stopped bothering us about those things. Another thing was very touching in a prison, how loyal prisoners were towards each other. Very often something happened that one couldn't go to work. We tried to hide him. We tried to help him, and Russians couldn't understand why we did that. Because to them, life of one man didn't mean anything. If Russian was dying, they just pushed him on the side and he died, and nobody would help him. But prisoners were, I think, they're a special breed of people. They, in a condition like that, one is just like a brother to another. And this is the reason why so many of us survived, because we were helping each other. We were sharing even the small amount of bread, and the Russian couldn't understand that. No way to communicate with anybody. We were out in the middle of nowhere. We had to build our huts before we had some kind of roof over our heads. The average day was like we were waking up as soon as it was light, and after some breakfast, what they call breakfast, we got a little bit hot soup, and we were sent to woods where we were asked to cut woods and put them on a bank of the river to be ready to be sent to the river when the spring came. That was in the winter time, and the work was very hard. Sometimes weather was so cold, it was over 60 degrees below zero Celsius, that they didn't let us go to the woods. When we were there, the snow was deep. We had to dig around the wood and start the fire before we could cut the trees. Sometimes we had to have a fire for 2 days before we could start cutting the trees. Of course, most of us didn't have enough protective winter clothing. My boots, which I had when I was arrested, wore out, and at that time they gave us some piece of tires, which we made into our to be able to walk on something. We tied them up with the strings. We used them as our shoes or boots. Winter was very hard, but we somehow survived. Not all of us. So people who didn't have enough strength to go to work slowly died, and some other tried to survive on minimum food. One of the guys one day escaped, and we never heard from him for about 3 months. After 3 months he came back. He came back and he said there was so much woods around that he had nowhere to go, and after 3 months he came back to the same camp. As a punishment, Russians kept him almost naked on the ice, and outside in the weather was under the freezing, and once in a while they poured the water over him. And but after 3 days, somehow he survived that. After 3 days they released him. They put him back in a camp. So there was no sense of trying to escape, because we knew that there was no way we could get to anywhere if we escaped. We were in that camp in very poor conditions. Several people died in starvation, and sometime in the morning when somebody died, we were called for the head count. We took the dead man with us, kept him between us, so we could get his ration for the day. And then we left him in our huts, but when the Russians found him later on dead. But at least we had his bread ration for the day. It happened several times, the same way that when they were counting us, some of our friends were dead. In November 1941, there was amnesty for the Polish people. That was because agreement, Polish government and British government and the Russian government to form a Polish army which would be fighting against Germans from Russia. There was quite a lot of Polish people, about 3 million people who were sent to Russia. Some of them were in prison like me, and some of them were so-called free settlers. Like my family, was sent to Russia in 1940. In the middle of the night, they came to my family house, and they told everybody to be ready in about an hour. And so everybody had to dress and take whatever possessions they had with them. They could carry only one suitcase per person. They were taken to the railroad station where they were put in the same cattle wagons. Of course, they were overcrowded with no provision for sleeping or sanitation at all. And they were in those wagons sent to Russia, to Siberia, where they were supposed to be settled after the 2 weeks of traveling in those cattle wagons. Once they were taken out of the train, put in some wagons, not the cattle wagons, horse-drawn wagons, and take into the into the farm, supposedly to be the farm where they supposed to be working. The conditions in there were very bad. They had one hut for several families, and they had to share everything between them. They were working mostly out of cutting the hay and stacking the hay for the winter. When the winter came, they were completely isolated without any food. The snow was about 2 meters high, 6 feet high, and they were cut off from any communication. At that time they had very little food, and they were trying to share as little as possible for as long as possible. That, because of the shortage of the food, several people died of starvation. One of the people who died was my father, was only 54 years old. He didn't survive that winter. Also my grandmother didn't survive that winter. She died of starvation also. After the winter was over, the Russians told them that they had several food parcels, waiting for them, but they couldn't get to them because of the winter and the snow. That was, of course, too late for my grandmother and my father. Except my father, there was my mother, my brother, and my sister, who was at that time only 7 years old. After my father died, they had to do best to survive. So my brother was working, my mother was working, and my little sister learned to do needlework, so she could do some sweaters for Russian army. And they paid them very little, mostly with the food, not with the money. They were in Russia till 1945. After the war ended, they asked them to be sent back to Poland, and they had quite a lot of difficulties to get back to Poland. The Russians tried to force them to take the Russian citizenship and stay in Russia. Of course, my family refused, and after quite a struggle, they were sent back to Poland. In the meantime, in 1941, in October, I was released from the prison after several weeks of waiting, and I tried to join Polish army, which was forming at that time near Tashkent in southern Russia. I was given a ticket and very little money to go and to travel to Tashkent. Of course, I almost starving. So first thing I did, I sold my ticket to get some food, and I was traveling like a vagabond on any means I could, on the wagon trains, on the freight trains, on the passenger trains, trying to hide from the Russians who were guarding those trains. When I reached Tashkent and Polish, first of all I was trying to find my family, which I have learned from some letters where they were located. After a couple of weeks, I found my mother, my brother, and my sister in a little village, Ustobe, near Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan. They were there. They were also released from these farms where they were working, and they went to. They were trying to get south to join the Polish army. Unfortunately, my brother was very sick, and when I joined them, he had typhoid, and he couldn't go to the army with me. After a couple of weeks staying with them, I went down farther south to join Polish army. Finally, I reached Polish army, and I joined Polish army, which was organized at that time in Russia. In the time of traveling, I have met a lot of Polish people. I met the Russian people, and it was also in very primitive condition. Our army was stationed near Jawabat. Our unit was stationed in Jawabat, and when I was inducted into the army, we were put in the tents. It was in the middle of the winter. I think it was January or February, and we were staying in the tents, which were dug into the ground, and snow-covered tents, so we could keep warm. We had a little stove, so it wasn't too bad. Food was much better than in a prison, but the sanitary conditions were very bad too. A lot of people started being sick with typhoid. I had, in our tent, there was 12 of us, and somehow we survived for a few weeks before being infected. After a few weeks, one of us got typhoid, and after him, all of us got typhoid. We were sent to hospital, and being a Polish hospital, which was at that time very primitive, they didn't have very much medicine, so the people in there, the nurses and doctors were trying their best to keep us alive. I was in hospital for about 3 weeks, and I survived the typhoid, but some of my friends died. Actually, there was a lot, about 25% of the people who were there died of the typhoid fever. From there, we were sent to another camp, Kermine, which was the camp from which we supposed to go and through the Caspian Sea to Persia, where the British supposed to give us armament and train us to become Polish units. To begin with, we're supposed to be fighting with the Russians against the Germans, but the Russians didn't have enough armament to give us and train us, so British government decided to take us to Middle East, train us, and So we would be fighting against Germans with the British and American armies. As I had some experience in flying before the war, after a few weeks after we reached Iran, those people who had some experience in flying were selected to go to Britain, to England, to be trained in Polish, become Polish Air Force, to join Polish Air Force. At that time, there were several of us who had some experience in flying. We were sent to Baghdad, and then later to Basra, and from there we were sent to Iraq, and put on a ship in Basra on our way to England. We were traveling from Basra to Bombay, and in Bombay we stayed for a few weeks to wait for another ship which would take us to Great Britain. After about a couple of weeks later, we were boarded on an American ship, Mariposa, and we were sent to England. We went on the way all around South Africa to South America, and around the coast of South America and North America we came to England, actually to Scotland from the north. We were traveling alone without any convoy, so we had to take a very long route to get to England. When we came to England, we joined Air Force, and we were trained in different towns and airfields. I chose to go to be a fighter pilot, so they sent me to school for fighter pilots, and we were trained in England on English planes. The training a year on several different planes. Then we were sent to different squadrons. I was sent to the squadron which was fighting at that time in France, Polish squadron, which was under the command of British Command, Tactical Air Force. And I took part in some fighting before the war was ended. On May 8th, the war ended, and we were at that time already on a German soil, and we were celebrating the news of the end of the war. After the war ended, we stayed with the Polish squadron 2 years in occupation forces in Germany, and after 2 years we were sent back to England when we were sent to the camps to prepare for the civilian lives. After 2 years in those camps, we were released from the Air Force, and we start our civilian lives. That's what it is. Of course, young pilot who started flying in the squadron was always assigned to the commanding officer of the squadron and told to just be with him all the time, not to do anything by himself. The first time I took off, I was number 2 on the wing of my commanding officer. We were supposed to attack some barges on the English Channel and some ports on a Holland, on the beaches of the Holland. And as I was taught, I was keeping myself on a wing of my commanding officer. Of course, there was a lot of commotion, and when we are attacking the ships, and later on when we are attacking some fortification on the port, I was just following my squadron leader. And everything seems to me very simple. When we landed back in our base, all my friends which were we were flying together, all the pilots from our squadron say, "Wow, that was a tough mission." And I said to them, "What do you mean tough? What was so tough about it?" And they say, "Well, what do you mean, what was so tough?" I say, "Well, I was enjoying my flight, my first operation flight." And they say, "Well, did you see all those little clouds around you?" I say, "Yes." They said they were anti-aircraft shells which were Germans were shooting at you. And of course, I didn't realize anybody was shooting to me. So I thought I enjoyed myself very much. And when they told me what was actually happening, then I really got scared. For the first time, I knew that somebody was shooting at me. But of course, that was the ignorance, as they call it, ignorance is bliss. So I was enjoying my first flight. On several occasions, different flights, there were different situations. One day I remember we were playing poker, and we were suddenly called to take off. There was 4 of us playing poker, and 4 of us took off. And because we didn't finish our hands, we put our cards in a pocket, and we went for operation. In that operation, one of our friends was shot down, and he never came back. When we came back, we found out he had 4 kings, so he would be a winner at that time. But unfortunately, he never came back. We were all very young and very enthusiastic about flying and about doing our duty. The worst thing for us was when there was a uprising of Warsaw, and we were in England and we couldn't help them, even that we willingly, we would like to fly and help the Polish people in Warsaw. The Russian at that time refused let our planes land in the other side of the Warsaw. Because of that, we couldn't reach, our squadrons couldn't reach Warsaw and come back. So we were sitting there and being able to help, we couldn't help because the Russians didn't agree to let our planes land. In the time of the war, of course, there's little different things which happens. One of them was that we took it very lightly because we were all so young and we enjoy our flying. But of course, there were also quite a lot of suffering when we lost our friends which we were flying with them. One of the worst things which happened, it was the last flight, on the 8th of May. We were sent to attack some shipping off the coast of Germany, and our squadron leader attacked the ship and was blown up to pieces by the explosion of that ship. About 2 minutes later, we were ordered to go back to the base because the war was ended. He died. I think he was the last pilot who died in that war. And if we got the news about the end of the war about 5 minutes before, this young man who was only about 25 years old would survive. It was really tragic for all of us. A very likable guy, and it was a great loss to our squad. Well, after the war, we came back to England, and after we were retrained, supposedly retrained by the British
No.
civilian life. In prison, I was surprised how many different nationalities were being arrested by Russian. There were some Czech people, some Slavic people in the prison together with me, and later on in Russia, in the camps, in the slave labor camps, I have met people from Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and of course different parts of the Russia. Some of the people like Kazakhs, they couldn't even speak Russian, and but they were sent there because they were denounced by that they were anti-communists. One of the very strange things happened when there was about an 80-year-old man in a prison, and I asked him for what he was sent to prison. And he said he was a teacher of geography in Russia, and one day he was taken to prison and sentenced to the 8 years of labor. And when he asked them why, they told him that he was anti-communist and he was criticizing Russian government for cutting too many trees without reseeding the forests. So he was criticizing Russian government, and for that he was sentenced for 8 years to 8 years of prison. In our camp there was a Romanian doctor, there were a Hungarian nurse, and there were different nationalities which I can't remember all of them. But anyway, there was like international gathering of people put in prison in Russia. Some of them were very simple people, and some were intelligent and educated people, like the doctor from Romania. And, I talked to this Romanian doctor. He could speak a little bit of Russian. At that time I could speak Russian too, and I asked him one day why he was in prison. He said, because I was taking care of the people who the Russians were torturing. So Russians told me, put me in a prison and said, if you want to be helping people who are anti-communist, we will be there with them. And that's why he was sent to prison. The other instances were different nationalities. I was very curious why they were there, and most of this was because they expressed or that they were dissatisfied with the Russian taking over their countries, or that they expressed dissatisfaction that they were not allowed to go to the churches and practice the religion. Of course, that was only the pretext to get people in a prison. Russians didn't want to use their own people for labor in Siberia, so they took as many foreigners as possible to do the work for them free. Most of us were in Siberia either in the woods, cutting woods. The other people were sent to mines, coal mines and gold mines in Kamchatka. Some of them survived, some came back and joined Polish army. And there were different people from different countries and different professions and different way of life. We were all there like one big family. There was no difference if the one was educated or the other one was not educated and were simple. We were all in the same situation, same conditions, and we tried to survive, helping one another. But, yeah.